All right, we've hit that magic number of 50. Good morning, everybody. For those who don't know me, we probably have some new people today, given the topic. I'm Chuck Nicole. I'm with Eversource. I'm in the legal department there. This morning, we have an exciting presentation on climate change. Our presenters will be Commissioner Katie Dykes, who I know you all know, as well as Dr. Rebecca French, who's the Director of the Office in Climate Planning at DEEP. She's also on the Governor's Council on Climate Change. She comes from a history background with climate. She's also, as I understand, a native Connecticut person, so that's great. So welcome, Dr. French. We also expect to have, and I'm not sure if he's on yet, but Kevin Grigg. Kevin is the Chief Executive Officer and President at Fussin O'Neill, and he's got a long and storied history in the consulting business. And I think he may be from Wisconsin. At least he went to college there. So
that's correct. That's my my undergraduate alma mater.
So welcome all of you. Some of you may know this, but not all of you. Eversource actually a couple of years ago made a commitment to go carbon neutral by 2030. And I'd be interested if our panelists know of any other companies that do business in Connecticut have made similar types of commitments. I've seen it obviously on the national level with a variety of different companies, but whether here in Connecticut, whether companies have done similar things. With that, I'll turn it over to the team on climate change. And thank you for attending this morning.
Great. Well, thanks so much for having me, and really exciting and obvious, and I think very timely to talk about this topic of climate change. Next week is we have Earth Day coming up, and I know with the Biden administration in place, it's been pleasantly difficult to keep up with how much is happening in Washington now in terms of animating funding and just a whole of government approach that the Biden administration is taking to tackling the climate crisis. Of course, we are no strangers to climate leadership here in Connecticut, and I'm going to just take a few minutes at the beginning of today's event to I'm going to go very quickly through a slide deck that summarizes what some of the strategies we've been employing here in Connecticut under the guise of the Governor's Council on Climate Change, and also to highlight some legislative items that are underway, under consideration in the General Assembly that will be transformative for implementing our climate agenda. But I want to pose this question for folks to think about. I'm always, I'm very interested in how companies in Connecticut are approaching the climate crisis, to the extent that Chuck, you mentioned the, whether it's internal corporate goals around reducing emissions, or thinking about how your companies or your clients are positioning themselves to seek out opportunities in some of the different programs and investments that are going to be coming forward around protecting communities from climate change and also reducing greenhouse gas emissions. I was really excited about the invitation today because I think that we at DEEP are, and within the Lamont administration, very, very, very interested in how we can use our response to climate change as a way to boost economic competitiveness and economic growth in our state. And so I want to hear from you today, your suggestions, your insights, from where you sit in your companies about how we can support those efforts, how we can work together, because it's necessary and urgent for us to address the climate crisis, and how we do so can have a pivotal impact on economic development in our state. So without further ado, I'm going to go to this slide presentation, and I will try to be really quick with this. So let's see. All right, let's see if I can get that geared up here. Let's see, and I hope folks are able to now see the screen.
Yeah, we can see it.
Yeah, is that working?
Looks good.
Okay, great. All right, so everything I'm going to be talking about in this presentation, it ties to the Governor's Council on Climate Change, or GC3. The GC3 was first launched under Governor Malloy, and it was relaunched and expanded by Governor Lamont through an executive order in September of 2019. There's two major objectives that the council has had. One is to continue to push forward on strategies to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. That's what we refer to as mitigation efforts. And then secondly, under Governor Lamont's expansion of the GC3, we have a second focus on developing and implementing strategies to help our communities adapt to the impacts of climate change. And so that means adapting to or adjusting, our operations, our systems, our infrastructure to respond to our changing environment, but also resilience. This is such an important word in climate planning. We need to have infrastructure and systems and an economy, frankly, that can withstand and respond to and recover rapidly from climate disturbances. And so adaptation and resilience are key parts of our strategy, and we're part of a renewed focus of the GC3 under Governor Lamont. Just quickly, we organized the GC3 process into 2 subcommittees and 7 working groups. There were over 200 people that participated in the working groups last year. Those working groups are continuing to meet this year, but a lot of work was done last year. Voluminous reports created by these working groups. Many of you on this call, I think, may have participated in some of these working groups. New under the GC3 process under Governor Lamont, we had a focus on working in natural lands. We are actually a heavily forested state. We have a strong agricultural economy, and those parts of our economy play an important role in sequestering carbon and also helping, and also they're being impacted by climate change as well. We had a focus on equity and environmental justice. That it's really important as we recognize vulnerable communities of color are getting hit first and worst by the impacts of climate change. But this has an important overlay for economic development opportunities when you think about opportunity zones and investment possibilities that I think are being supported at the federal level for advancing climate strategies in opportunity zones and environmental justice communities. So I'm going to keep going here. As you know, you see from this slide, very excited about the bottom-up approach that we held for the GC3. In spite of a pandemic, we conducted over 186 different public meetings. Kudos to Rebecca, who coordinated all of those. With, again, over 200 volunteers who participated in the 7 different working groups, hundreds of recommendations that came together around those different 7 working group focus areas. And that all resulted in this report that was finalized in January of this year, recognizing the urgent need to address climate change. This is a phase 1 report that we issued early in the process because we wanted to capture near-term recommendations, things that were kind of the no-brainers that we need to do yesterday. There were 61 recommendations that were included in this report. If there's one thing that a reference that I hope folks will go and take a look at after today's webinar is this report. It's on our website, and it captures the kind of a blueprint of action, some requiring legislation, some that we can do within existing authorities, some that we're looking to businesses and partners to help move forward. So let's take on the depressing part of this presentation next. Get that out of the way. Connecticut is vulnerable to climate change. We are not unique in that, I think, but it's important to highlight what we need to be preparing for in terms of impacts from climate change. So first, we have to be prepared for an increase in intense and frequent storms. This is Tropical Storm Irene from 2011. That storm, coupled with other storms, Hurricane Sandy, really highlighted some of the vulnerabilities of our infrastructure. This is a substation in the Bridgeport area that nearly was knocked out by flooding. And so it highlighted the need to move up or build up or relocate much of our electrical grid infrastructure in certain vulnerable locations. Hurricane Sandy, also another tragic reminder of our vulnerability to increased frequent intense storms. Connecticut is second only to Florida in the percentage of our insured property value that is vulnerable to some of these climate change impacts, including sea level rise. We certainly don't have the sheer, in sheer numbers, we're nowhere near close to Florida, but in terms of the percentage, we have a significant exposure just given the high property values along our coastlines. And so this is why it's incredibly important, if you think about what that means for our property tax base and for our economic thriving, for us to advance solutions that help reduce emissions and invest in resilient infrastructure. Road flooding is going to be something that becomes more frequent for us, not just during storms, but also on sunny days as we see sea level rise increasing. And that means that infrastructure, this is Route 146, down along in Branford, these are low-lying road structures that are unfortunately going to be much more vulnerable to climate impacts. So that means that things like culverts, tide gates, road investments are going to be critical parts of the way that we address and adapt to the impacts of climate change. Heat waves, we can expect that by mid-century, we're going to see a 5-fold increase in the number of days above 90 degrees Fahrenheit in our state. That's not just kind of uncomfortable for folks who have air conditioning, but for many of our vulnerable populations who may be struggling with respiratory illness, asthma, and may not have access to conditioned air in their homes or in their businesses. This is, for workers who are doing outside work, construction activity, this is going to be a significant challenge that we have to prepare for. And then drought is another impact that we have to be ready for. We saw drought conditions last year. More frequent, more intense droughts are going to be part of our future going forward. That means more stress on many of our natural and working lands. So this is basically, this chart right here outlines what the scientific projections are telling us about the possible, what may unfold with climate change. And the most important takeaways here are that because of the emissions that have already gone into the atmosphere as a result of human-induced activity over the last several decades, we have to prepare for, we have to expect that we are going to see all the things that I just described. All of these different impacts are kind of baked into our climate at this point. And so we have to prepare for those changes which are going to be occurring with high confidence by mid-2050, by mid-century. But the future beyond mid-century is very much in our hands right now and depends on the actions that we take together over this coming decade. Our challenge is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from current levels as quickly as we possibly can. And if we're able to do so, the science is telling us that the climate could stabilize after mid-century. We'll still have some of those negative impacts I just described baked in, right? But we will be able to at least stabilize the climate after that point. If we do not urgently reduce emissions during this decade, however, we have to expect that we will see runaway warming and catastrophic impacts accelerate after mid-2050. So that's why we have these two tasks, monumental tasks, that we have to take on simultaneously, preparing for the impacts that are inevitable, that are going to be getting worse through mid-2050, through mid-century, and at the same time transforming our economy to reduce emissions so that we can prevent these impacts from getting worse after mid-century. So I just highlighted a few of these different impacts, of course. I'll go quickly through these, but I think the key is to know that here in Connecticut, we have, I'm sorry, I'm not sure how this graph is not showing, but we have the governor's, the Global Warming Solutions Act that was enacted originally in 2008 prescribes a path for us to reduce emissions over the next by 45% economy-wide by 2030 and 80% by 2050. And all around us, states in New England, in the Northeast, on the West Coast, and increasingly in the Mid-Atlantic are taking on similar types of targets. So I'm going to go really quickly through a couple of the different recommendations that came out of the Governor's Council on Climate Change for reducing emissions. Again, a very strong focus on equity and environmental justice, recognizing that vulnerable communities are going to be experiencing more profound impacts from climate change just because they have fewer resources to be able to mitigate and respond to those challenges. So one of the things that we're doing is launching a statewide environmental justice mapping tool to highlight where those vulnerabilities are going to occur. Another major focus is to continue our investment of reducing emissions, is to continue our investment in energy efficiency. That's one of the least cost ways for us to reduce emissions. It also is something that helps us save on energy costs. I know for business competitiveness, we are in the unfortunate and unacceptable position of having some of the highest electricity rates in the lower 48. We are more in the middle of the pack in the country in terms of the bills or the costs that people pay for energy in the state, but our rates are high. So energy efficiency funds, which have been protected by Governor Lamont in his first two budgets while he's in office, are critical resources available to businesses to help reduce energy costs and reduce emissions. And would love to hear anything we can be doing to better position those funds and make them more accessible to businesses. Our solar programs as well, through CPACE and other types of programs, we know are a big game changer for helping businesses reduce their energy costs. And then, of course, Governor Lamont has proposed a goal of achieving 100% zero carbon electric supply by 2040. I'm very proud of the work that we've done over the last 3 years in advancing investments, particularly in offshore wind. 20% of our energy supply will be coming from offshore wind by 2025 as a result of contracts that have been signed over the last few years. We've seen the cost of offshore wind come down in those contracts by 20% since 2017. We see the Biden administration moving forward with plans for an infrastructure bill that will drive major investment in port infrastructure, in transmission buildouts. These are critical infrastructure investments that are going to drive jobs in our state and around the region to be able to interconnect these offshore wind resources. And I'm really excited about how we can work together better to advance opportunities for supply chain and manufacturing in the state of Connecticut, because we know the more we can onshore the production of component parts for the offshore wind industry, the lower the cost of those components, the offshore wind projects will be, and the greater the economic development value of our climate mitigation effort will be. So this is something that we're really just at the beginning of. Signing the contracts was just the start. And now we have a major opportunity to try to lock in more of those upstream economic development opportunities as related to offshore wind. Another major focus of our mitigation strategies in the GC3 report is reducing emissions from the transportation sector. The transportation sector is responsible for the lion's share of our emissions. We cannot reach our greenhouse gas reduction goals without reducing emissions from transportation. And so I'll talk about this more in a moment, but our prime objective for reducing those emissions is by implementing the Transportation Climate Initiative program, which will generate $1 billion in revenue over between 2023 and 2032 that we can use to invest in clean transportation solutions. I believe that this program will be transformative for businesses and economic competitiveness in the state of Connecticut. We have companies in our state that are producing biodiesel that can be blended into diesel fuels through TCI, under the TCI program. It will drive demand for biodiesel. The TCI program will enable us to provide funds for rebates for fleet owners, business fleets. We know even in the state of Connecticut, looking at our own vehicle fleets, that it's already cost effective to switch from gasoline vehicles, passenger vehicles for our passenger vehicle fleets, to electric, because the operating and maintenance costs of the electric vehicles is lower. We're hearing from other fleet owners, other businesses around the state who've done similar calculations and are eager to tap into rebates and dollars for charging infrastructure so that they can take part of this opportunity. And so I just highlight this as one of the many ways that the TCI can really help businesses across the state. At the same time, we know post-pandemic, we've attracted a lot of workers to the state and retained them here in our state during this pandemic because people value the quality of life that we have here in Connecticut. And TCI can drive more investments in those quality of life type amenities that help keep quality workforce here in the state, including bike trails, walking trails, providing for broadband expansion that can help people not have to continue to telework and not have to drive a vehicle into an office, providing for all kinds of transit-oriented development enhancements. These are things that reduce emissions, but also enhance communities and help attract a talented workforce into our state. In working in natural lands, another really important part of our economy, we know that there's a huge market for offsets that's taking off in the forestry sector. At the same time, you know, we see that natural working lands can provide enormous benefits as quote unquote infrastructure, the protection of salt marshes and building out of rain gardens and swales and so on that can absorb rainfall from intense rainfall events. These are going to be increasingly important parts of our ecosystem that help our communities adapt to the impacts of climate change. And so there's a lot of really exciting recommendations in this area as well. With respect to infrastructure and land use adaptation, so this is a really critical piece. We have both gray and green infrastructure that needs to be updated to adapt to the impacts of climate change. And this is my little friend. Hi, I'm busy right now, buddy. Hang on just one moment. Okay. All right. Come here. Sorry. Sorry about that. Solo parenting this morning. All right. So infrastructure investment is going to be really critical. I'll talk a little bit more about legislation that we want to advance to help with this. But it goes without saying, this is a job creator. These are infrastructure investments that are going to protect properties, businesses all along our state and provide for the kinds of reliable infrastructure services that we need for a thriving economy. Public health, another major focus, accentuated by the pandemic. We know that climate change is going to exacerbate many of the stressors that we already see in our communities around public health. We see drinking water and investment in drinking water infrastructure as another really important element of our response to climate change from a public health perspective. I think it's going to be very relevant to the business community here in the state. And then finally, financing and funding adaptation resilience. This is the first time we had a specific focus on this in the GC3, and I'm really excited about the recommendations that came forward in this working group. I think if there's one working group report to take a look at, this would be one of them. But you know, we have here in Connecticut the Green Bank, first in the nation Green Bank, that's really been piloting and pioneering that approach to leveraging, using public dollars to attract private investment in clean energy and mitigation measures. We want to expand that model to resilience and adaptation investment as well. At the same time, we see that there's a broad need for investment in resilience infrastructure, and there's a lot of great recommendations that came forward that we're seeking to implement through statute now that will help drive revenue for investment in different ways for resilience in our state. So let me just go forward. I think I'll go quickly now because I want to make sure we get to have time for discussion. There are a number of tasks remaining for the Governor's Council on Climate Change. One of the most important is that we are conducting a vulnerability assessment this year to take stock of the assets and operations of the state. You know, that Route 146, for example, that's vulnerable to flooding, or looking across our building stock across the state. We are doing this assessment to really identify what the vulnerability is for infrastructure in the state. And, you know, interestingly, about a year and a half ago, for the first time, I got we were asked by the Treasurer's Office to help them respond to questions from the ratings agencies who were asking about what Connecticut is doing to invest in climate resilience, because Moody's and others are starting to score both state and municipal debt based on how proactive a jurisdiction is being to address its potential climate risks. We see that that's going to be accelerating. If you've seen some of the announcements coming from the Biden administration around incorporating these risks into how debt is scored and in financing generally. And so again, this is where Connecticut's leadership on climate is, I think, setting us up to for better fiscal health in the state. And so this vulnerability assessment is intended to help us score those opportunities for investment in a way that's transparent and that we can get more credit for more broadly. So this is a really important part of our next steps on GC3. Now I want to turn to some of the legislative actions that are implementing, that would implement recommendations that have come forward in our Phase 1 report. The one I want to start with is the Transportation Climate Initiative, which would be implemented through Senate Bill 884. This is for folks, I don't know how many folks are maybe hearing about the Transportation Climate Initiative, or TCI, for the first time on this webinar, but just very briefly, it's quite simply implementing the same successful structure that we've been using in the Regional Greenhouse Gas Emission Program or Initiative Program for power plants. We're now applying that same approach to the transportation sector. So at its basic, the TCI program will implement a cap on emissions from the transportation sector. The primary, all the emissions coming from the transportation sector are related to the combustion of gasoline and on-road diesel fuel in vehicle traffic. And so this program would set a cap on those emissions and would require wholesalers, those who are fuel suppliers selling these fuels at wholesale, to purchase allowances to cover the emissions associated with the sale of their fuels in the state of Connecticut. And then the state would auction off those allowances to those fuel suppliers, and the proceeds, the revenue from the sale of those allowances, would generate about $1 billion that it would be up to Connecticut to invest in clean transportation solutions that reduce emissions. This program, I'll say that there's been a lot of misinformation put out there suggesting that it would impact gas prices, increasing them up to 17 cents. That's not true, but I'm happy to take on any questions in the Q&A if people want to talk through some of the myths that are out there, or go into more detail about that. But we do expect, through detailed modeling, that the program will likely have an impact on consumer gas prices of about 5 cents in the first year of the program, which would start in 2023, and that would increase to about 10 cents by 2032 as the cap declines and emissions reduce. But it would be, again, it would generate $1 billion that we would have available to invest in a whole host of different transportation solutions that can reduce emissions. And I think that this is going to be really critical for if you're a business that has a sustainability goal. These are dollars that could be available to you to help supplement or offset some of the costs that you may need to get access to electric vehicle charging, or support for shifting vehicle fleets over to electric, or expanding transit services to help your workers get to work on time. There's expanding our rail services, increasing, there's just a whole host of things that we can do with these dollars that will reduce emissions and at the same time improve air quality here in the state of Connecticut. So we expect that the program will drive us 26% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions from transportation. Importantly, we would be implementing this program with the states of Rhode Island and Massachusetts, as well as Washington, D.C. And by working on a regional basis, that means that we, are able to leverage a regional auction. We would be, each state would have funding available so that we can invest in eliminating range anxiety for electric vehicle charging on our shared transportation corridors. And again, we found that working together in these multi-jurisdictional ways is a great way to advance climate progress and enhance economic competitiveness. The second bill that I want to highlight is House Bill 6441. And this is the Climate Change Adaptation Bill, which implements many of those recommendations from the Financing Climate Adaptation Working Group of the GC3. We need to find, at its most basic, we have perhaps a tsunami of funding that's going to be coming out of Washington for both gray infrastructure, as we think about those, berms and tie gates and expanded culverts and so on and so forth, as well as green infrastructure like those salt marshes, those rain gardens, those swales that can absorb intense rainfall events and wave action. We have the possibility of an enormous amount of federal funding that's going to become available for investment in our state, so critical to protect property values and businesses in our state. But those federal dollars nearly in every case require some level of state or local match funding. And so the goal of this bill that going forward is to authorize several different potential funding mechanisms to generate that incremental revenue needed to provide the match for the federal funding. That will enable us to be at the front of the line to tap into dollars coming from HUD and from FEMA and from other parts of the federal government that can drive these investments. It is inevitable because of what we have to expect by 2050 in terms of these impacts. We have to make these investments in infrastructure, right? For resilience, we want the feds to pay for this as much as possible, and being proactive to get these funding sources in place is going to be critical for us to be able to do so. So again, this highlights just, billions of dollars, that we're expecting. This is from an article just in January 25th of this year. And since that time, it feels like every day we're hearing more, particularly with the infrastructure bill, about these dollars that could come available. So it's critical for us to get enactment of this bill. The various tools that it would, or funding mechanisms that would authorize would be authorizing municipalities to create stormwater authorities that can address flooding and pollution, enabling municipalities to adopt a real estate conveyance fee that again could fund adaptation, mitigation, resilience projects. Many communities have flood and erosion control boards, but they don't currently have the scope to cover both flood prevention and climate resilience. So we want to add that to their scope so that they could do special assessments or other types of and take on some of the operation and maintenance opportunities related to developing this infrastructure. And finally, the bill would expand the Green Bank scope to enable it to cover not just climate mitigation, but to finance adaptation and resilience projects. The last one I want to highlight is another governor's bill, Senate Bill 882, which concerns climate mitigation and home energy affordability. A centerpiece of this bill is that it would put into statute a goal of supplying 100% of the state's electricity needs from zero carbon resources by 2040. We did an extensive analysis of this bill to find out how feasible it would be in our draft integrated resource plan. And the good news is that Connecticut is already on track to be 91% carbon free in our electric supply by 2025. That's in part due to investments in energy efficiency, solar, onshore wind. 20% of that is coming from offshore wind by 2025. And another really major contributor is nuclear. As the state signed a contract with the Millstone nuclear facility to prevent it from prematurely retiring, which would have been really catastrophic in terms of affordability and reliability of our electric grid. It also ensured that we could retain over 1,000 jobs in the Waterford area associated with that facility, It's just a very critical facility for our regional grid, and now contributing a significant portion of our zero carbon electric supply. So based on that analysis in the draft IRP, we believe that this goal is feasible and achievable, and it's really important to have long-term goals set in statute to drive planning. Okay, and so lastly, I would say that, you know, these investments in clean energy we see as a major job growth opportunity for the state because of the, you know, investments in the policies that we've had in place for, you know, more than almost 2 decades now. We've seen significant growth in clean energy jobs, significant expansion in clean energy jobs associated with energy efficiency, with solar, now with offshore wind, and we're really excited about those opportunities coming forward. And so with that, I'm going to wind up this presentation. I really appreciate it's a lot to get through. I appreciate the patience that everyone has listening to all this. And now I really want to turn it over to Kevin Grigg, who's a member of the Governor's Council on Climate Change. Kevin has been a terrific supporter of these efforts and provided a really important perspective as a business leader in the state on how we can align our climate strategies to economic competitiveness. So Kevin, I'll turn it over to you.
Well, thank you, Commissioner, and good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure and a privilege to speak out on behalf of the Transportation Climate Initiative. As some of you may know, I'm the CEO of the state's largest engineering firm and am myself an engineer. Those of you who are fans of the comedy series The Big Bang Theory may recall Sheldon claiming with some disdain that engineers are part scientist and part grease monkey. As an engineer, I am here to tell you that the science around climate change is unassailable. While today we may only be hearing the whispers of the widespread impacts of climate change on our health, our economy, and the financial performance of our businesses, it will be but years, not decades, before those whispers become shouts. The unwitting contributions of private business to climate change have been pouring out through smokestacks, energy efficient buildings, manufacturing processes, and, as the Commissioner mentioned, vehicle emissions for generations. We as private business leaders, therefore, have to step up and become significant contributors to both mitigating and adapting to this climate crisis, and we have to do so today. As a result, I strongly recommend all of our support for the Transportation Climate Initiative program. No piece of legislation is perfect, but in my opinion, this initiative is a bold and constructive beginning to a new era of private business partnering with the public sector to assume a leadership role in addressing this pressing issue of climate change. As private business leaders, we can either bury our collective heads in the sand or essentially kick the can down the road, or we can act now by supporting this important program. The longer we wait, the more expensive it's going to become for us to address, both because climate change and its adverse impacts on our health, our economy, and our businesses are growing exponentially, but also due to the time value of money, which those of us in the private sector are well aware of. In order to bring some perspective to this issue, and I'm going to be brief, and as we all know, the pandemic to date has claimed the lives of roughly 3 million human beings worldwide. There's no way to diminish or trivialize its impact and the tragedies that it has brought to the doorsteps of so many people. My own family has been impacted. By way of comparison, air pollution causes 7 million premature deaths annually on a worldwide basis, and I'm holding up the most recent copy of the National Geographic. The headline is "The Fight for Clean Air. Air pollution causes 7 million premature deaths a year." All of this is to say that many of the pollutants that contaminate our air and drive global, national, and regional health issues and associated healthcare costs are the very same pollutants that drive climate change, namely greenhouse gas emissions. Support from businesses like ours aimed at reducing these emissions and reducing our carbon footprints is therefore absolutely essential to addressing both of these generational issues, both climate change and the healthcare crisis. Specifically, our support of the Transportation Climate Initiative program is the best near to midterm action that we can all take to help address the impending climate and public health crises. So with that, I'm going to turn it back to the commissioner, and as she and Dr. French mentioned, I believe they're happy to entertain any questions that we may have.
Thank you so much, Kevin. And that's right. We'd love to kind of turn over for some dialogue now with the time remaining, and answer any questions, or most importantly, I'm just really interested to hear from folks about your perspectives, your company's perspectives on addressing climate change and how we can work together.
Let's not be shy out there. This is our opportunity. And by the way, for those in the chat function, Dr. French has posted a number of different documents for people's perusal. The latest, the IRP, obviously, the January report.
Chuck, I'm not shy.
I know.
So I was wondering what the commissioner's take is on legislation that's currently in front of the General Assembly, or legislation yet to come, but hopefully this session, to increase energy storage and for Connecticut to come up with a real system to have commercial scale energy storage. I think, from my opinion, that's the next step in our energy future, is to deal with the intermittency of wind and solar. We need robust energy storage solutions. And right now it's one area where Connecticut isn't a leader in climate change response, although for the most part we are.
Thank you so much for that, Lee. You're right. We have a very priority focus on resources like energy storage. For anyone who takes a peek at the draft integrated resource plan, one of the big takeaways from our modeling there is that we've made great strides in investing in intermittent renewables to achieve our emission reduction goals. But we need much more investment in the resources that can turn on, in emission-free resources that can turn on when the sun isn't shining, when the wind isn't blowing, in order to meet electricity demand. So those resources include battery storage, demand response. Hydropower can provide some of that balancing in certain circumstances. I think there's a lot of different resources that can be utilized for that feature, but storage is certainly a really critical part of it. We saw legislation initially coming out in the General Assembly that would have given DEEP the authority to procure grid scale storage. I think at the moment it looks like what's moving forward is a bill that would codify PURA, establishing a tariff program for behind the meter storage. And I know that the PURA proceeding, I think, may be well known to many on this call. PURA has been advancing a docket that would establish a tariff for a significant amount of storage resources to be deployed, again, on customer premises, not focused on the large grid scale facilities. So, Lee, I'm not sure if your question, when you said commercial level, if you're talking about behind the meter for commercial businesses or more grid scale storage.
No.
But
no, I'm talking about grid scale storage.
Okay.
Because right now, a grid scale storage unit is treated by the EDCs as a large industrial customer, which has all the surcharges and everything else associated therewith. And I will tell you that every time a renewable energy developer in Connecticut goes in front of the siting council, for example, the siting council starts asking very detailed questions about why they don't have energy storage associated with it. And the answer is that Connecticut doesn't have a program for grid scale not behind the meter energy storage programs, either as a standalone unit or as an integrated part of a larger renewable energy resource.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, we have, and this has been something that's been, that we've seen in when we've done procurements for renewables, we've had the authority and we've invited bids in many of our grid scale renewable RFPs for several years now for renewable projects that are paired with storage. But because we are, we haven't had like 100% electric supply goal. Those RFPs have been more focused on meeting the RPS goals, which are indifferent to when the energy is delivered. So without getting into all the wonky details of it, we just haven't had the policy framework where we've been evaluating the benefits of availability and dispatchability that storage provides to a renewable project. So we very much want to make that, turn that corner and be valuing the availability and dispatchability features of our emission-free resources in our grid scale procurements. And that's where we were hoping to get that authority for storage procurement through the General Assembly. So we'll see where that goes. But I will say that, in addition to legislative vehicles for authorizing deep procurement, we are also very focused on ensuring the ISO New England wholesale market structure is creating a positive investment climate for storage and other types of emission-free integrating resources in the region. So, for example, recently had the opportunity to testify at FERC around, some of the issues with our capacity market and the MOPR. But as part of those comments, we've been underscoring from Connecticut's perspective how critical it is to update or to reform our energy and ancillary services markets, which will drive more revenue and value for grid scale storage. And I will say we did see significant amount of storage projects clearing the most recent forward capacity auction in ISO New England, which is a positive, including, I believe, some projects to be developed here in Connecticut. But there's a definite need for storage. Our IRP shows that, but our procurement and market designs are not reflecting the value that storage provides currently, and we're very focused on helping to remedy that.
Commissioner, this is Matt Hackman. Following on to Lee's question, and I've asked this question a lot of times in CBIA, I apologize, but the idea of behind the meter and also shifting over to electric in the transportation sector, are you thinking about building out the charging infrastructure to go both ways, so to speak, such that all those vehicles represent, storage capacity? I mean, Germany and other countries in Europe have used that as a way to ramp up quickly in their storage capacity.
Yeah, so the great point. Again, I have to applaud the leadership at PURA. Chairman Gillette has been advancing a docket on electric vehicles and electric vehicle charging that I think is, as it moves forward, I think it's poised to unlock important kind of rate design and role for the utilities in terms of managing charging for vehicles to optimize charging times and speeds for to minimize impacts on the grid, which is a real positive in the first step. But we see, real opportunities with the Transportation Climate Initiative to, be able to drive investments at scale in those types of configurations that will, again, integrate more electric vehicles and optimize for those charging impacts on the grid. So, for example, a couple of weeks ago, I was down in Middletown with the governor. We did a press event to celebrate the first electric school bus that was purchased by Middletown with support from the Volkswagen Settlement Fund, which provides a very modest amount of funding, grant funding for medium and heavy duty electric and efficient diesel vehicle purchases. And so Middletown purchased this school bus. It was the first one in the state. With TCI, we could, there's 6,000 school buses in the state. We could support the conversion of all of those school buses over to electric. And there's some really interesting pilots that have been done in different states around, when school buses are not being utilized to move our precious cargo, our kids around. They can be plugged in as storage resources to discharge power to the grid and vice versa. And so I think those are some of the really creative and value added applications that we could pursue. Again, if we had the funding available to provide for bulk purchase of resources like that. And then also, I see the TCI program as being critical for ensuring that charging infrastructure is being built out equitably all around the state. We know that the private market will drive a lot of investment in charging in those areas where there's lots of EV deployment, but we're going to have gaps that we need to fill, in rural areas or along our interstate corridors to address range anxiety. And so this kind of funding will help us provide for the accessibility of charging needed and to fill in some of those gaps that may emerge.
Commissioner, speaking of TCI, what's the status of other states signing on to that? And after you answer that, I'd like to hear from Dr. French about her team and what she's doing day to day to implement all the, the policies that we're working on.
Great. Well, I'll take the first one then. So we have, there were more than a dozen states that have been participating in the design and development of the TCI program over the last, this has been a 10-year project if we go all the way back to the start, but really intensive work over the last 2.5 years in designing the program, modeling the program, and so on. And so, again, more than a dozen states were participating in that. In December, 4 of those jurisdictions announced the moving forward to seek to implement the program. That's Connecticut, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, and Washington, D.C. But the number of states that, the other states that did not announce that they were moving forward to seek to implement at the time, they are still at the table, however, participating in the design discussions, developing the model rule. And I'm really confident that over time, we will see more states joining the TCI program. This is something that happened with RGGI as well. Connecticut was a charter member in getting the RGGI program off the grounds, developing the auction platform, getting the model rule in place. And once we did that, more and more states joined over time. In fact, we have new states joining TCI even now, with Pennsylvania joining RGGI even now with Pennsylvania coming in and some other states in the wings. So I'm very confident that we will see more states joining over time. It's just a matter of timing for different jurisdictions about why they decided to move forward now or wait a little longer. But I think the prospects are very good for those other states to join. And I'll turn it over to Rebecca to talk about what she's tackling at DEEP.
Thank you. Thanks for the question. Well, it's, as you can see from the breadth of what the Governor's Council on Climate Change did, the scope of work is large. But I want to reiterate what the Commissioner said at the outset, is that we're taking a whole of government approach. So although I do head up the Office of Climate Planning, we are a small and nimble team, but we really work in partnership with all the divisions of DEP. So clearly we've had a strong energy team, and so I really leave it to them a lot on the energy side of things, but I'm working to integrate the carbon storage and sequestration into our environmental conservation division of DEP. It's a new area for them, so working with them on how do we start to quantify the carbon that our state forests are storing and sequestering for us. What does that mean for our management goals for our state forests and public lands, and what policies can we promote with our private landowners, where actually is the majority of our trees are in private lands in Connecticut. So that's one area, and I work very closely with the Environmental Quality Division, particularly in the area of resilience. So, clearly they work a lot on permitting. It's also where we do our coastal zone management. So all of these programs are increasingly having a resilience aspect of them. We're having to look at anything that's proposed in or near a floodplain. Now we're incorporating sea level rise into the decision making about what can be built there and where and why, and not just the current conditions, but the future conditions. So that's a really new area that I'm often advising and a part of those discussions. Reaching outside of the agency, some examples, working closely with the Department of Insurance, which is increasingly concerned about climate change and the exposure of our insured assets in this state and the exposure of our insurance companies to the impacts of climate change. So Commissioner Mays has taken a real leading role, not only in the state, but nationally as well. I think he's chairing a new working group related to climate change within the National Association of Insurance Commissioners. And I think that really rose out of him being a part of the Governor's Council on Climate Change. It really got him more educated on the topic and interested and inspired by what's doing, and looking at how insurance could take a leading role and where their places in the conversation. Doing the same thing with Department of Emergency Services and Public Protection. So the funding program, the federal funding program, Commissioner Dykes talked about, with the FEMA building resilient infrastructure in communities. And I know, many of your companies do environmental engineering. You've probably worked with municipalities doing coastal resilience plans, or maybe it wasn't called resilience, but it was about stormwater management or coastal flooding issues, which is climate resilience. The federal government is putting more and more funds into what was called the Pre-Disaster Mitigation Program, and it's now been renamed the FEMA Building Resilient Infrastructure in Communities. This used to be just a $25 million a year federal program. Last year it grew to 250 million. The current fiscal year that we're in, it grew to 500 million. And then that newspaper article we shared, says that they could potentially have up to $3.7 billion coming into that program as a result of some changes that Congress made in 2018 to the program. So what was really sort of a pittance, and so Connecticut really didn't put in that many applications. There wasn't a lot of funding there that was worth the time of preparing the applications, to be honest, is now on the scale where we this year, I worked with DAS, Department of Transportation also advised on this. And the state of Connecticut put in 32 applications totaling $123 million. And I've heard that, nationally they received over $900 million in applications. So Connecticut was about 10% of the total amount of funds requested from that program. So we're really actively going after those federal funds. And again, working with DESP, who runs that program, and then we're trying to align our programs with those federal funding opportunities. So there's also bond funds that the governor has proposed to support an expanded microgrid and resilience grant and loan pilot program. So in the September special session, we expanded that program, or the legislature expanded that program, and now the governor's asking to authorize additional funds to support it going forward, and we hope to use those funds to get Connecticut in a place to plan for it. So I'm starting on the initial steps, hoping that the funding goes through on getting that program set and ready to go. So stay tuned for opportunities to help advise the agency and my office on how we can design that program to best meet the needs of municipalities. And I know that our private sector environmental consultants are often the ones working hand in hand with municipalities to design projects. So I know you have a lot of firsthand knowledge about what is needed. And so I really welcome your participation in that. So that's just a snapshot. I do a lot of other things too, but I should probably stop talking now. But we also work I also help represent the states at the U.S. Climate Alliance. So I'm also got my hands in trying to coordinate across states as well on climate mitigation and adaptation and resilience policy and planning.
If I could add to Dr. French's comments for just a moment, a part of our business is professional services. A part of it is more direct hire construction work. And in both elements of our business, we're seeing nationwide instances where either consultants or contractors have been sued because they have not adequately addressed climate related issues in either the planning, design, or construction of what they're doing. And this is happening even in instances where the scope of what the client has asked us to do does not include or does not specifically call out addressing climate. So it's becoming quite clear, and I think this is a trend that's going to continue to grow, that our profession, and I think this is either happening or going to happen very soon in other allied professions, we are being expected to know and to proactively address climate issues in whatever we plan, design, or build, whether the client has that level of interest or sophistication or not. I just think it's related to the whole sort of insurance and liability issue that Dr. French mentioned just a few moments ago.
Thank you very much. Commissioner, any final thoughts? And I just want to thank all three of you for your presentation today. Obviously, there's a lot going on here. And maybe you can talk about what's the next big thing for the GC3? What are they tackling now?
Well, we have a meeting coming up next Thursday on Earth Day. So
Tuesday.
we have a number of legislators who will be joining in that event. But, really would love to think about, I don't know, if are there, to the extent that any of the companies that are participating today, the folks who are on today, interested to hear from you. If you have sustainability leads within your businesses, within your companies, we'd be really interested in trying to organize a convening of those individuals. It's something that we want to do more of, is have direct dialogue with businesses to understand what your sustainability goals are so that we can design our mitigation strategies, our adaptation strategies, our programs to help support those efforts that companies are committing to. So that's just something I put out as a follow-up. Would welcome any suggestions from folks or contacts so as we look to strengthen those ties. But thank you so much for the time today. CBIA obviously plays an incredibly important role here in the state on a number of different ways, including bringing us all together. So I appreciate you inviting us and for everyone, for your time and attention today.
Thank you again. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Take care.
Take care. Oh, but before you go, Commissioner, can you provide your slide deck to Marcy so that we can have it for the membership?
Sure, happy to do so.
Thank you.
Have a great day, everybody.
All right, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
So next up for our meeting is Lee Hoffman on the energy world.
Since we spent quite a bit of time talking about the energy world with the commissioner's visit, I'm going to keep this relatively brief, Chuck, if that's okay.
That's fine.
Okay, and you might want to turn off your speakers for the first part. Because I'm going to talk about docket 200803, which is the peer review of the storm response by the two electric distribution companies, Eversource and UI. As we were meeting last month, the PURA was coming out with its decision on the appropriateness of the response by UI and Eversource to the tropical storm last August. And the agency came out with the draft decision on March 19th and allowed for almost a month until April 12th for exceptions to that decision to be filed. And they're going to have oral arguments on Monday the 19th. It's a 111-page decision, and I won't bore you with the details of it, but cutting to the chase, Pura found that both agencies acted imprudently, and that actually means something in utility speak. When when something is found to be imprudent, that means that the utilities can't recover those costs from the ratepayers, and that those costs actually have to be pulled from the shareholder value of the companies. So, as you may recall from prior meetings, PURA had already opened a docket called PURA Consideration of Civil Penalty and Enforcement Action Against the Electric Distribution Companies after Storm Isaias investigation. And if you're already opening a docket up to discuss penalties, you're pretty sure that you're going to come up with them. And for those of you who are frequent practitioners in the circular liability world, this is kind of analogous to that. This first docket figures out who's liable, and then the second docket's going to figure out for what they're liable and put a valuation on it. And so what PURA has tipped its hand is they're going to look at putting return on equity penalties on the utilities, disallowing storm cost recovery, additional civil penalties, and further remedial or enforcement orders. And that's the one that has me the most concerned for the utilities. At the end of the day, if you disallow some storm response costs, and basically what the agency is saying is you had to scramble and get more expensive repair crews to come in from out of state than if you had planned ahead and had done something sensible. And so we're going to disallow those costs and some other costs. And the civil penalties will be what they'll be. But the return on equity penalties is going to have a longer term effect on the utilities' ability to borrow money and to do other things because they're not going to get as much money on their investment. And the injunctive relief also has me concerned. Again, analogizing to environmental enforcement, you may get hit with a $25,000 penalty, but if you in turn, in order to resolve the issue, have to put in several $1,000,000 worth of equipment, that's the penalty that really hurts rather than the monetary fine. In addition, the utilities have already been ordered to redo their emergency response plans by the end of June. There's particular concern around how the utilities handle make safe work. In other words, if there's a down power line blocking the road, that's the first thing that has to get dealt with. And there were problems liaisoning with towns and the like, so they have to figure out how to do that, as well as how to communicate with their large customers in a better fashion, all by the end of June. There is, as I said, oral argument on this next Monday, and what I find interesting is Eversource, at any rate, has, in addition to two lawyers who will be doing the oral argument, Craig Hallstrom, who's the president of the Connecticut Light and Power Company, which is the technical entity that Eversource functions under. Connecticut Light and Power, even though it's gone as a trade name, still exists as the formal corporate name. And Mr. Hallstrom is going to be doing at least part of the oral argument, which shows how seriously Eversource is taking this. Just a couple of other quick hits, because I know that you've heard enough energy for one day. On the PURA side, PURA's got two dockets open. One is to develop administrative processes and program specifications for virtual net metering. I don't know if John will be talking about this later under governmental affairs, but it seems to me from the outside looking in, the General Assembly's not going to expand the virtual net metering program, at least not in this term. And if they do, it will come with some pretty significant limitations. So PURA is looking at how they can squeeze every last kilowatt of virtual net metering out of the existing program by improving some of the administrative processes. And then there's another interesting docket that's coming around now with the LREC ZREC program in Connecticut. There's different prices for different sizes of projects. Some developers have gotten, I dare say, cute, and instead of doing one megawatt project at the price for 1 megawatt, they're doing 10 100 kilowatt projects and taking advantage of the small ZREC tariff. That's now ruining it for everybody else who may want to put several 1 megawatt projects on the same piece of property to achieve some economies of scale. And now PURA is looking at whether or not all of that is the subdivision of projects. I think that'll be more ripe for discussion next month or in June, but it is something that bears watching. And then finally, on the siting council front, it's getting to be very interesting. The solar developers have gotten fairly sophisticated with their agricultural development on solar projects because the Department of Ag has to sign off on most, not all, but most solar projects before they can get approved, particularly through a petition process. And so some of the solar developers have decided to start beekeeping and distilleries. Others have decided to graze sheep within the panel array. Um, and it's making for a very interesting what happens once these things get built. The siting council's used to the switch flips and then they don't have to do anything else on the project. And now they're in the uncomfortable position of trying to figure out whether there's too many sheep at a site, how much sheep poop affects water quality standards. Um, they're also now asking solar developers to prove that the solar panels pass the TCLP test before the panels get installed. Never mind the fact that TCLP has to do with leaching hazardous waste after something's disposed of and it's crushed into little itty bitty pieces. They're having them do that for the panels to just sit there and do what they do, which is generate electricity. And they're also looking at impacts on streams, and the siting council is increasing the number of hearings that solar projects are having, all of which is to say that the cost of getting a solar project approved is increasing almost by a factor of 2x. And it's getting far more difficult. And then last but not least, in proof that renewable energy is now a mature industry within the state of Connecticut, every year the siting council, well, not every year, but every other year, the siting council asks for load forecasts from the energy facilities to figure out how much load, how much capacity do you have, what load do you expect to serve, et cetera, for planning purposes. Well, renewable energy facilities, because of their intermittency, had never been asked to do that before. Now, for the first time, solar and wind facilities are being asked to do their forecasted loads for the siting council because in the aggregate, they're now making up enough of a percentage of Connecticut's generation mix that they have to be accounted for planning purposes. And Chuck, that was 10 minutes. And so I'm trying to keep it short.
Thank you, Lee. Obviously a lot going on. So
Happy to take questions though.
hearing none, the waste, Harold and Mark, I don't know if Mark's on, but Harold and Mark, you're up. Water's on deck.
Morning, everybody. How are you all? Just want to go over a few things on our Waste Task Force Summary Report on pages 1 and 2 with respect to implementation of the new RSR Wave 2 regulations. DEEP has posted on their website annual inspection form and a fact sheet. Both are available on the website. The link is referenced in the settlement materials. A couple of things that you should all know is that with respect to the fact sheet, they were due, quote unquote, to be available and posted or available on by the property owners on the property on or before April 17th, which gets us till tomorrow. And with respect to the inspection forms, annual inspections under the new EUR regulations are to be performed between April 1st and July 31st. So please check the website. I want to make sure you're all aware of that, or those two requirements. Moving on to page 3 of the task force summary. As you all know, DEEP noticed proposed spill regulations for issuance on March 11th. The comment period is open until May 10th, and there's a public hearing on April 27th. In that regard, CBIA is soliciting comments from you all with respect to a potential comment letter for purposes of the open comment period. I have summarized a few of the comments that were received previously, as well as some that were offered during a call that Ashley Jane, I can say that 3 times fast, honest. Ashley Zane from CBIA chaired earlier this week with respect to setting up a smaller group to discuss the proposed regulations. Feel free when I finish to offer any comments on that, and Ashley provide Ashley the opportunity to offer anything further with respect to that as well. Finally, I just want to touch on the status of the release-based program developments that are taking place with respect to the working group. The working group's continuing to meet. The next working group meeting is May 11th. Topical subcommittees are continuing to work through the issues before them ahead of reports to the working group in June. And again, if there are any CBIA members that are on the call that are participating in the working group or the topical subcommittees that would like to provide any additional comment, happy to do that at this time. And I think I'll just ask Ashley if there's anything else she wants to add with respect to the spill regulations.
Hi, everyone. I will touch base when we get to the government affairs portion, but Harold, you pretty much covered everything. If you have any comments, please feel free to reach out to me. You can either email, call me, text me, whatever your preferred method of communication is. And if anyone else is interested, I can also send the full notes around to the group. But yeah, thanks, Harold.
Thanks, Ashley. And I'll also open it up to any comments with respect to the spill regulations that anybody might want to offer now, or we will probably set up another call before comments are due. And if you'd like to be on that working group, please let Ashley know. And also, if anybody has anything that they would like to offer with respect to the release-based program, with respect to the working group or the topical subcommittees, we've got a few minutes if you'd like to chime in.
Harold?
Yep.
Why are we having spill reporting regs if we're working on release-based regs at the same time?
Well, maybe that's a good comment, Lee.
I think it is. I think it's an excellent comment. I wish I had come up with it, but it's one that I heard at the working group meeting on Tuesday. But I think that that's the salient feature of everything. And I guess I've just volunteered myself for your working group. Hi, Ashley.
Lee, it's always good to have you aboard.
One of the other challenges, Lee, this is Nancy, is what's happening with the RSRs. You know, I, along with a couple of others, are on our own little ad hoc advisory group looking at the transition between Transfer Act and the release-based program. And we've strongly recommended that the RSRs be maintained, but that's not clear that that's going to happen. So we've got potentially 3 sets of regulations wandering around at this time. We're trying to figure out how those fit together and have raised that issue for Deep and the working group.
That's a timely comment, Nancy. Thank you.
I'm try to be timely.
And I just want to say that just for sartorial splendor alone, we're happy to have Lee part of the spill regulation group. Mark, would you like to weigh in on anything with respect to the test to our summary report?
I can address something, but I'm not sure if you're able to hear me.
We can.
Okay. I just want to mention a quick note. A part of DEEP's recent Connecticut Coalition for Sustainable Materials Management, which is an effort they put together to reach out to municipalities to address tools for reducing waste generation and improve upon waste processing and disposal or recycling opportunities. They've been emphasizing organics, and briefly what they're referring to is food waste, brush, leaves, chipped logs and tree limbs and so forth, with the notion that the more we can take out from the waste stream, the fewer problems we'll have sending materials out of state for disposal, and also provide more cost-effective options. And as noted in the March presentation, there's increasing concern about biosolids. And unfortunately, the world of composting is now beginning to experience the pain of PFAS consequences. So the technologies and strategies that may be deployed to reduce the volume and end up with a usable product, a finished compost, may be more challenging as regulations develop or policies are implemented to begin additional testing. And it's a big concern in the wastewater industry, and I think it's going to balloon in terms of testing and analysis of products resulting from composting, including anaerobic digestion. And with that, I'm happy to answer any questions.
This is Dave Hurley. A couple of things. One, in terms of the organics that you were just talking about, PFAS are going to become a big issue with all of that. And then in response to Lee, I think that historic releases and the requirement to report something that you find in the ground at depth is different than a spill, and they should be treated separately.
I agree, but they're all supposed to be treated under the new release reporting regulations, David. So I'm not sure why we've got one versus the other when we're specifically dealing with in the working group what you do with historic versus spills.
Under the proposed release-based cleanup standards, they're going to cover spill response?
Supposedly, they're going to make it like Massachusetts.
Yeah, maybe that is problematic with spill reporting at the same time. And they should be different.
Hey, Harold, I had a question. Brian Freeman here. I had a question.
Brian, how are you?
Good, thanks. A question for Mark. Mark, picking up on your comments, it sounded to me that you were saying that the PFAS issue is going to be a concern for organics, recycling, anaerobic digestion, composting, et cetera. For biosolids, certainly, with obviously there's a pathway there, potential pathway. But were you also suggesting there are other feedstocks that were going to be an issue with respect to PFAS? And I suppose to partially answer my question, for food waste, to the extent there's packaged food that has PFAS liners and the like that may be in play. Is that what you had in mind?
Well, it's complicated because it could be in the food products themselves. It could result from the packaging of the food and any incidental transfer of PFAS or other substances to the food from the packaging. And then I recall Matt Hackman talking about chocolate cake and concentrations of PFAS in something as common as chocolate cake. So I think this is, an evolving story, but it just seems anywhere that people test for these contaminants, they find them. And they're in our bodies, and they're in our food, they're in the food packaging. So identifying, let's say the culprit, that could be very challenging.
And Mark, this is Matt Hackman, and you're right. It was in chocolate cake, and not only that, it's in our house dust. And I was interested to learn that the EPA says each of us, on average, eats 30 milligrams of house dust a day, which, considering what's in house dust besides PFAS, seems a little gross. And kids, because they're smaller and closer to the ground, I guess, eat 100 milligrams a day of house dust. But Mark, my question, with PCBs, there's a lot of sort of fear factor that came into play with PCBs. And, we got citing and landfills saying, no PCBs, no PCBs. In a lot of locations. And I'm just wondering, it seems like with the concern over forever chemicals and dark waters and, communities looking at facilities in their community are going to just say, no PFAS. And that would be problematic because I don't think you're going to find no PFAS.
Okay. Anything further? If not, I'll turn it back over to Chuck.
Okay. Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Harold. Water, Debbie and Wojtek.
Good morning, everybody. This is Wojtek. Hope you can hear me.
Good morning. Yep, we can hear you.
Okay, great. So we don't really have much to report. I just posted a link. Hopefully that works for everybody. This is regarding stormwater general permit for industrial activities. And if that doesn't work, you can refer to the handouts, which it also has a link there in the dedicated section for you. Basically, as you might already know, DEP is seriously thinking about extending this permit for another 3 years for us, which I think would be good news for everybody. So if that's the case, the extension would be until September 30th, 2024. And with that said, I hope everybody's doing well with the registrations for the significant industrial users general permit. Just a reminder, they're due April 29th. And also the miscellaneous industrial user general permit submissions to your local water authorities. Those are also due. And with that said, I'm not sure if Debbie would like to add anything else.
Nope, I'm good. Just busy working on my SAU registrations here.
Right. I have one more sample to collect today, and hopefully the results are good, and maybe we'll make the deadline. I don't think they're gonna extend it for anybody.
Okay, well, thank you, Wojtek and Deb. So next is our EAR task force, Steve and Dave.
Hi, good morning. I don't think Steve is able to join us today, but I'll just give a few quick updates. Last week at the SIPRAC meeting, Lynn Hamgen from EPA Region 1 gave an overview presentation of kind of everything they're looking at and what what's going on up there. So if anyone's interested, certainly check out the slides posted on Deep's website for that. There's a lot of information in there, but just a few things of note. The ozone attainment has always been a big deal for us here, and it's getting a lot of attention not only from Region 1 but now from headquarters as well. So what they're seeing and what we have seen, but what's really on their mind is our ozone monitoring data is showing that there's been significant, we've kind of seen this before, but there's been significant reductions over time, but we've really leveled off, particularly in the last 8 years or so. And that's with over that, that's combined with over that time we're seeing this kind of flattening of our ambient ozone concentrations. There's been a continued significant continued reduction in emissions of NOx and VOC. So been doing a lot of effort to get those emission reductions, but not seeing it in the ambient air concentration monitoring data. And what there's what we've been aware of, certainly, and not that they're not aware of it, but transport is certainly a big piece of this, and weather is always a big piece of this. So one thing that was noted, 2020, emissions were significantly lower just due to the pandemic, but combine that with particularly hot, dry summer, especially towards the later months, and we still saw significant ozone exceedances. So we had 17 total days in Connecticut, and that's by far the top in New England, where Rhode Island had only 3. I think Massachusetts had 1, and I think Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont didn't even have any last summer. So so it's getting attention from Region 1, also from EPA headquarters, and we'll see if anything actually happens. I don't know. I take that for what it's worth. I mean, kind of, especially even Deep has always pushed on the transport issue, and for what it's worth, this is the most it sounded like EPA is may actually take some significant action on it beyond what they've done at at a more regional and national level. So there, we have talked in the past a little bit about this cross-state air pollution rule, which had some legal challenges and has now gotten past that and has been finalized back in March last month, which Lynn had noted that that those changes have some significant reductions to overall emissions associated with it, but that's not going to be enough to get Connecticut into attainment. And Deep has done some modeling. When that rule first came out, Deep had done some modeling that showed that those reductions under that regulation were not going to be sufficient for Connecticut. So so they are looking at it. We'll see. I'm not holding my breath, certainly, because it's been a long time issue, but it is getting more attention, I guess, from EPA headquarters specific towards Connecticut and New England than it has in the past. So there may or may not be something that that comes out of that. There's also a lot of activity on the OTC side of things, looking to potentially control emissions from some coal-fired power plants in Pennsylvania, and also some other transport-related petitions that they've submitted to EPA. So time will tell. So that was a big piece of the presentation from EPA. Just another couple handful of things that were maybe of interest. They had noted that we've talked about in the past that the once and always in policy that has been repealed several years ago and has now late last year was finalized as a regulation, basically affirmatively saying that that policy is not the way EPA is going to interpret applicability of major source MACT and NESHAP rules. EPA noted they have received some petitions for reconsideration or judicial review of that regulation. Nothing has changed or has come out of that yet, but just something to keep an eye on. So as of now, that rule is still in effect as it was, and any former major sources of HAPs that end up taking limitations to reduce their potential to emit are in effect, they're eligible to exit any major source NESHAP programs that may be applicable to them. And then just a couple other things. We also heard that EPA has approved a method for sampling PFAS from stationary sources in air emissions. So that's interesting. It'll be interesting to see if they, based on that method, now start requiring certain facilities or sources to actually do that testing and measure their emissions of PFAS compounds going forward. They also mentioned they have, I think, 3 or 4 monitoring sites now that they've set up to throughout the country to measure deposition from the air. So just ambient deposition of PFAS compounds from the air. So they're looking closely at it, and I think Lynn even made a comment that she didn't get it explained, and I'm not sure how they were able to do this, but she said they have one of their sites, I think, was in New Jersey, and that they're measuring air deposition of PFAS compounds in New Jersey that they think we're able to trace back to a source up in Maine. I'm not sure exactly how they made that came to that conclusion, if it was just the nature of the compound was unique or if there's some other rationale behind it. But it's something they're looking at, and it certainly appears that they're looking at deposition from the air and looking to take that data and trace it back to sources. So that's going to be something that's interesting to watch, and something that I think is probably going to be, it could lead to, requests or requirements for facilities to do testing if EPA is of the opinion that that's the source of, or a contributing source of what they're measuring at their depositional monitoring locations. So anyway, just something to point out. And then so that was kind of the main interesting things that Lynn presented, but there's also just something going forward, just back to the ozone that she mentioned, and that Tracy Babbage mentioned also. It's that assuming they can't wrap their arms around the transport issue and ozone continues to remain an issue and out of exceeding the national ambient air quality standards, Connecticut DEP will be then required to continue to take measures to reduce emissions of NOx and VOC as we remain in non-attainment and potentially get bumped up and classified into more stringent categories if we can't reach attainment by our applicable deadlines. We could be regulated as a severe or severe non-attainment for ozone versus moderate or serious that we are right now. And so what Tracy Babbage had mentioned, and didn't really give a ton of details, but that Connecticut is working with EPA to somehow quantify and demonstrate that all the activity with offshore wind development will contribute to air quality improvements based on replacing fossil fuel fired generation, I guess, but that's in the works, and that they can take credit for that, which if that will be important only because we've been reducing emissions for so long now, and doesn't we've kind of plateaued our ozone air quality improvements have plateaued. So if we continue to remain in non-attainment and under the Clean Air Act, Connecticut DEP keeps being forced to show progress and improvements to emission reductions, that will be helpful. That demonstration with the wind contribution will be helpful because otherwise things like additional restrictions on stationary source emissions and further ratcheting down VOC requirements as well would be the only other avenue they could really pursue there. So that's a good thing. But anyway, so that's about it. And just one reminder, it's in the handout too, but May 1st starts the ozone season. So any emergency generators that are subject to NOx RACT are going to have to pay attention to the air quality forecast. And so there's a handful of ways to follow it: the email, there's a phone message, internet page. So any of those can get that information out, and make sure you're following it one of those ways starting May 1st. So that's about it, Chuck. So I'll shoot it back over to you.
Thank you. And I'm going to flip it right to Ashley and John.
Good morning. How are you guys? Ashley, would you like to go first?
Sure, I'll start. So for the Environment Committee, we're kind of in a holding pattern right now. We're waiting for a lot of the bills to be filed with the nonpartisan office, the Office of Fiscal Analysis, which will put a fiscal note on a lot of these bills, well, all of these bills, and then a file copy that will include any substitute language that these bills got during the committee process. So right now we're sitting and waiting, and after listening to this discussion, I'm also going to be sending out a list of all of the PFAS bills and a quick explanation of each one so that this committee has it, since there seems to be an increased interest in it. And if you guys have any specific questions on any of the bills, please let me know. The Deep Commissioner went through a lot of the climate change bills already, so I won't regurgitate that. And if you have any questions, like I said, please call me, email, text. I'm available. John?
Thanks. Like I said, good morning, everybody. Ashley hit on it. We're in like a 2-week period where things are kind of a little bit slow. Bills are coming out of the committee, getting their JFF language attached with bill descriptions and fiscal notes. It gives Ashley and I a little bit of time to catch up with member companies as to where they stand on particular bills. And it's a good time to assess each of the bills to make sure that what was in it is still in it, and that certain things were pulled out. So as I said, we've been reaching the members, and the following bills on the energy side since the beginning of the session continue to come up. The first of which is Senate Bill 855. That's the one that separates DEEP and PURA. It's interesting. There seems to be bipartisan support on that. I don't know if it'll end up going anywhere because I don't think the commissioner likes it too much. But I think from CBI's perspective, it would be good to have the separation of the two at the end of the day. Whether or not that happens this year or not, I don't know. The commissioner mentioned Senate Bill 882, which mandates zero carbon for electric suppliers by 2040. We're asking for that to be a may rather than a shall. And Senate Bill 950 is of interest to both some of the larger utility companies. Eversource and UI would allow for vegetation management for more efficient vegetation management protocols. It can be a controversial bill because it kind of pits the energy against environment folks. Senate Bill 952 is a solar bill that Lee mentioned earlier, creates some solar energy goals. It does not now include an increase in virtual net metering. That language did not make it out of committee, and it's an error that I mentioned it here in the comment section. That does not exist. SB 999 is a bill that came out of the Labor Committee, and it deals with private labor agreement and Class 1 resources and the development of those. it would drastically increase the cost of developing certain renewable projects. So we're going to help to try and weigh in on that and against that. Last is House Bill 6562. It's an act concerning electric suppliers. Gives further authority to PURE in a number of areas. It's been watered down a little bit, but folks are still concerned that some of the sections will apply to commercial rather than residential. And that's about it. That's what I have for today. I'll certainly be happy to answer any questions. And I would also, as Ashley mentioned, encourage any of the members that don't see their bill on here or there are other bills that they think we should be paying attention to please bring those up. But to date, that's been what we've been focused on. So I thank you guys for your time.
Also on the regulatory side, real quick, for any members who are on the subcommittee working groups for the release-based system working group, I can start an email chain. So this way you all are on the same area, because we do have a lot of E2 members who are on those committees. So this way you have a platform to talk to each other, bounce assumptions, questions off each other. So if that would be helpful, let me know. I'll start that. And if it proves not to be helpful, we can just ignore the email. Back to you, Chuck.
Okay, then. I think we're at the end of our agenda. Anybody out there have anything for the good of the order that they would like to share? Going once. Our next meeting, as Marcy did not put that up, is May 21st. And more stuff on PFAS. Same time, same channel. Other than that, stay safe. Get your shot. I've had both of my shots. So far, so good. And hopefully we'll be back together in person sometime this year. Marcy, do you have anything else that you want to share? You're mute.
Nope, just for our conference in June. Don't forget to register, and hopefully see everybody in May.
And hopefully there won't be any snow for our northern part of our state.
It all melted at my house.
All right. Thank you, everybody. Take care. Stay safe.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.